History still remembers Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, the woman who refused to marry, the woman who ruled alone, the woman who turned her maidenhood into mythology. But I don't think Elizabeth was just rejecting marriage. I think she was doing something much more complicated. She was crafting an image, a political identity, a personal brand centuries before social media even existed. And that image was brilliant. It protected her. It elevated her. It made her beloved. But over time, that very same image that once protected her became a cage that she couldn't escape. Because Elizabeth I wasn't missing queen energy. Far from it, in fact. She was commanding and brilliant and theatrical and decisive and overall just politically gifted. But the way that she protected that queen energy was by performing the Maiden so perfectly that eventually the world forgot there was a real woman underneath the facade. Today, we're going to be diving into Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, and the gilded cage of the Maiden archetype. This is the story of one of history's most powerful leaders that eventually became trapped by the image that made her powerful in the first place. Hey there, lovely, it's Gata, and welcome to my channel. This is my little corner of the internet where I like to talk about feminine psychology, famous faces, and the archetypal patterns that shape the way we move through the world. If that sounds like something that's interesting to you, I invite you to pull up a chair and join the conversation. I'd love to have you. Elizabeth was born on September 7th, 1533, the daughter of King Henry Tudor VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn, who, yes, has made her own appearance on the channel before. Because truly, no one knew how to create generational chaos and trauma quite like the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth entered the world as this long-awaited royal child, but almost immediately, her position became unstable. First and foremost, she was born a girl, which was a very unfortunate lot in life if your father was Henry VIII. Before her third birthday, her mother was executed. Her parents' marriage was annulled, and the former princess was declared illegitimate. And this is really one of those details that becomes more and more absurd the more that you mull it over. Anne Boleyn was executed on charges of adultery, and then Henry retroactively went back and said the marriage never counted in the first place. Tudor legal logic is truly a castle of contradictions in its own right. We don't have any verified records about how Elizabeth felt about this sudden upheaval in her life. But what we do know is this. From a very young age, Elizabeth learned the hard truth that her status and position could be upended overnight. Safety could vanish. Love could become political. And femininity, especially royal femininity, could be dangerous. Despite her sudden change in station, Henry does seem to have shown affection to his young daughter. Even after the birth of his long-awaited son, Edward, Henry seems to have doted on Elizabeth, despite his ill will toward her mother. From early on, people noticed something interesting about Elizabeth. She was precociously serious. One observer casually noted that she had the gravity of a 40-year-old. And I love this little detail because it tells us so much about who Elizabeth was as a person. We've all met a little human that acts like an old head, and I think it is so funny, but very telling about their personality. From the moment she was born, Elizabeth had presence, command, this sense of watchfulness. And this commanding presence would become one of her greatest assets, but also one of her heaviest crosses to bear. Now, Elizabeth wasn't just composed, she was brilliant. One of her tutors famously remarked that her mind showed no womanly weakness, that her perseverance was equal to that of a man, and that she was a quick learner. As such, Elizabeth received a rigorous education, the type usually reserved for male heirs to the throne. Languages, theology, history, rhetoric, philosophy. Despite her precarious position in the line of succession, it was clear that there was something special about Elizabeth, something that set her apart. She was every bit her parents' daughter, clever and quick-witted like her mother Anne Boleyn, dramatic, politically instinctive, and fiery like her father, Henry. Even though women had far less political standing during this time period, looking back, it seems like Elizabeth was bred to rule. All three Tudor siblings would eventually sit on the throne, but it would be Elizabeth, the redheaded middle child, the daughter of the executed queen, the princess who was declared illegitimate, whose leadership would go on to define the era itself. At just 13 years old, Elizabeth lost her last surviving parent when Henry VIII died in 1547. Her younger half-brother, Edward, ascended the throne. And that placed Elizabeth in a delicate position. Until Edward grew up and started a family of his own, Elizabeth was third in line to the throne, behind her older sister Mary. This meant that she wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a political possibility, a symbol, a pawn, a target. Anyone who wanted power in the kingdom could look at young Elizabeth and see her as a golden opportunity. And unfortunately for Elizabeth, some of those threats were coming from inside the house. A brief note for you before we continue. This next section of the video is going to make mention of inappropriate advances toward a minor. I'm not going to be lingering on any of the details, but it is relevant in understanding Elizabeth and the type of ruler that she'd grow into. So, after Henry's death, Elizabeth moved in with her beloved stepmother, his sixth wife, Catherine Parr. Catherine pretty quickly moved on and married Thomas Seymour, who was the younger uncle of King Edward himself. After Catherine died just 1 year later, Thomas, then 40 years old, turned his sights on Elizabeth. She was only 14 at the time. It did not take long for his political plot to unravel. Seymour was arrested on charges of treason in 1549, and after investigating, it became clear that even when Catherine Parr was alive, he had made inappropriate advances toward his young ward. And I cannot imagine the depth of pain and confusion that Elizabeth must have felt during this time. She had already lost her mother, then her father, then Catherine Parr, who'd been a source of warmth and maternal stability for the young princess. And now here she was, getting dragged into adult scandal and political danger and personal violation at an age when she should have been protected. But Elizabeth's response during this investigation tells us a lot about who she would grow into. When questioned, she was careful, measured, and prudent. She betrayed no emotion. Even after she received news of Seymour's execution, she remained composed. And I think this is one of the first real examples we see of Elizabeth retreating into what I call the good girl mask. And she didn't do this because she was weak or because she lacked feeling or emotion about what had happened to her. No, I think Elizabeth understood, even from her young age, how dangerous it would be to allow her emotions to rule her in this moment. She knew if she drew too much attention, if she seemed too emotional or too invested or too ambitious, it could destroy her. She'd seen it happen with her own mother. So, what did she do? She hid behind the image of a demure, docile princess, poised, elegant, calculated. She learned to move through the world with her head down, never drawing too much attention to herself. She played the supportive sister. Her survival was dependent on appearing harmless. And Elizabeth would get plenty of opportunities to refine that image and mask, because when King Edward died at just 15 years old, Elizabeth's older sister Mary took the throne, which meant Elizabeth's position became dangerous all over again. You see, Mary was determined to reunite England with the Catholic Church, a controversial break that her father had made in order to marry Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth, as the Protestant heir to the throne, became a symbol for those subjects who oppose Mary's religious reform. And I imagine it would have been really tempting for Elizabeth to lean into that support, to rally her supporters, to become the Protestant alternative. But Elizabeth knew better. She conformed outwardly. She publicly supported her sister. She moved carefully. And even then, with all of her precautions, suspicion found her. Elizabeth was accused of treason and held in the Tower of London for 2 months, the exact same tower where her mother had been held in the days leading up to her execution. Just imagine the psychological weight of that. To be the daughter of Anne Boleyn, locked in the Tower of London, knowing the fate that awaited your mother once the Tudor dynasty decided that she'd become too dangerous. Elizabeth was learning a brutal lesson. Tudor England had very specific expectations for women. Power wasn't going to come from openly defying those expectations. Not yet. Instead, real, meaningful power would come from leaning into those expectations intentionally, on her terms. When Queen Mary died childless in 1558, Elizabeth's moment had finally arrived. She was 25 years old. She was the last of Henry VIII's children to take the throne, and her coronation was met with celebration. One observer wrote, "If ever any person had either the gift or the style to win the hearts of people, it was this queen." And Elizabeth was determined to keep that positive momentum going. But from the moment she became queen, one question followed her everywhere. Who was she gonna marry? Everyone in the kingdom knew that this was more than just a personal question. It was a political one. At the time, England was militarily vulnerable. A strategic marriage could forge powerful alliances, but it could also create powerful new enemies. If Elizabeth chose any one royal suitor, she risked alienating all the others. If she married an English nobleman, she risked empowering one faction over another. If she married a prince from outside of the country, she risked placing England under foreign influence. And what I think was probably the most important thing to Elizabeth, if she got married, she was going to be expected to share her power. And that's not something that she was keen on doing. So instead, Elizabeth made a different, brilliant play. She entertained the question without answering it. She allowed her suitors to hope, to court her even. She encouraged their advances for months, sometimes years, all the while extracting diplomatic benefits for England. This was not indecision on her part. It was strategy. She realized it was far more advantageous to have multiple men vying for her affection rather than choosing one and losing the rest. I think it's also really important to note that for years before this, Elizabeth had been resistant to the idea of marriage. But her suitors didn't need to know that. Here again, Elizabeth is strategically leaning into her maiden archetype. Youthful expectation, romantic possibility, demure coyness, the promise of love that was just out of reach. She became the woman that everyone dreamed of winning, but no one could ever actually possess. And that image became her greatest political invention. Elizabeth and her court became masters at crafting this image of the chaste virgin queen devoted only to ruling her beloved country. The dominant narrative then became that she was so dedicated to England that she was, in effect, married to the realm. And that became her brand, the ruler that was so dedicated to her people that she vowed to remain a maiden forever. And yes, I do mean brand, because let's be very clear that this is personal image management at the highest level. Elizabeth very clearly understood performance and symbolism. She was also acutely aware that rulership was about more than just policy. It was about perception. One French ambassador was quoted as saying, "She is a princess who can act any way she pleases." And the part that Elizabeth wanted to play was sovereign ruler of England. And this is where I think Elizabeth becomes so fascinating. She had this duality to her personhood, the outside image that she portrayed to the world, and then the inner workings of a real leader. If we only look at Elizabeth as a trapped maiden, we miss the full picture of who she was. Because here's the thing, Elizabeth was not lacking in queen energy. On the contrary, she had it in abundance. She was audacious, intellectual, politically gifted, theatrical, and commanding. She streamlined her council of advisors to create a tighter, more efficient monarchy. She valued her council, but wasn't swayed by the opinion of others. She was intellectual and could weigh out the facts carefully before arriving at her own conclusions. She was steadfast, certain, and deeply aware and confident in her own abilities. The outside maiden image is what made people trust her, but it was the queen underneath that made her effective. And that's the duality. Elizabeth secured her power by presenting herself as untouched and unmarried and devoted and almost mythically pure. But once she had that power, she wielded it like a real ruler. She was so confident in her abilities that she made no secret that she was unwilling to share what she'd worked so hard for. At one point, she angrily insisted, "I will have here but one mistress and no master." That line tells us everything. Elizabeth understood the power she held. She understood the vision that she had for England, and she was not going to let anyone else's ambition dilute that. But that refusal to share power also reveals something darker about the Virgin Queen. Because the maiden archetype, at its healthiest, is emotionally open. She's curious, hopeful, receptive, and connected. But Elizabeth's maidenhood wasn't primarily about being open. It was about perception and protection. It was a shield, a performance, a way of remaining untouchable. And when emotional openness is strategic instead of genuine, it gets corrupted. It can become conditional, opportunistic, even manipulative. Elizabeth knew how to stir up emotion in people. Like her father before her, she had a gift for dramatic speeches, emphatic pleas, and overall theatrical rulership. She knew how to make people feel. She befriended powerful noblemen, showered them with gifts and praise, let them think that they had special favor with her, only to later find out that they were one of many. One day, she might value an advisor's opinion. The next day, she'd be cold, distant, or worse yet, furious with them. Her emotional nature could be warm and persuasive, but it could also be mercurial. And please understand, I'm not saying any of this to minimize Elizabeth into this cruel, evil queen, because imagine the pressure she was under. If she wanted to be taken seriously by her contemporary male rulers, she had to be ruthless. She had to be strategic. She had to learn how to play people against each other. She had to cauterize all the parts of herself that made her vulnerable. And I think that's the real tragedy here. The maiden image gave her power, but that power meant she had to stay emotionally contained, limited, forever desired, but never possessed, forever devoted, but never fully fulfilled, forever open as a symbol, but closed off as a woman. Another part of the maiden archetype that people often think about is youth, liveliness, and beauty. And Elizabeth, she understood the importance of image. She was always incredibly thoughtful about putting her best face forward. But when she was 29 years old, Elizabeth contracted a pretty serious case of smallpox. The illness nearly killed her and left deep scars across her face. For Elizabeth, these scars were more than just cosmetic. They were political. She needed to remain desirable enough for her suitors to keep knocking at her door. She needed to remain visually powerful and pristine enough for her subjects to believe her myth. So she became increasingly fixated on her outer appearance. Public photos showed her draped in the most luxurious fabrics of black and white, gold and silver. Bright red hair, a clear nod to her Tudor lineage, solidified her legitimacy. Her already pale complexion was lightened even further by using Venetian ceruse, a thick white foundation made of vinegar and lead. It created the porcelain-like complexion that was popular at the time. It was also toxic. And as the years marched on, Elizabeth relied more and more on this poisonous foundation, first to hide the smallpox scars, and eventually to hide the signs of aging. As her hair slowly faded to gray, she used brightly colored wigs and dyes to preserve her signature Tudor tresses. Elizabeth couldn't stand the sight of her aging body, because for her, aging wasn't just about getting older. It was a cruel reminder that one day her reign would end, that this carefully crafted virgin queen mythology did have an expiration date, that the eternally youthful maiden figure that she'd built her empire on couldn't last forever. And yet, there was no easy way for her to evolve outside of the confines of that maiden-like image. Elizabeth was always meticulous about the way that she was represented publicly. Her portraits regularly incorporated symbols of virginity, purity, and maidenhood, even as she got older. She even commissioned an official face pattern, which was basically a model portrait that all other artistic depictions had to be based on. While researching this video, I obviously pored over many of these portraits of Elizabeth, and I found it fascinating to see her transformation over the years. Because there's this point in the artistic interpretations of her where something shifts. There's a moment in time where she stops looking like this luminous, visionary virgin queen and starts to look like something a bit more uncanny. Not worse, not less powerful, but distorted, frozen, almost mythological in a way that no longer feels human. And here's the thing, I don't think that's a coincidence. In fact, I think that we can trace that visual distortion to the fact that the maiden archetype no longer fit who Elizabeth was as a person. She'd lived too much, endured too much, ruled too long, survived too fiercely. She'd long ago lost that wide-eyed innocence that her reign was built around. But because her power relied so heavily on her image as a maiden, she had to keep performing the role. And eventually, the cracks started to show, both literally and symbolically. The idea of a personal brand feels incredibly modern. We associate it with social media, with aesthetics, with a curated identity, with deciding how we want people to perceive us. But Elizabeth I reminds us that personal branding has been around for centuries, and it can be an incredibly powerful tool. A personal brand can help you move through the world intentionally. It can help people understand who you are, what you value, and what you stand for. And Elizabeth's personal brand was brilliant. It helped her rule. It helped her maintain authority. It helped her transform personal vulnerability into national mythology. But people aren't products. They grow, they evolve, they change. And if you don't allow your personal identity the grace and space it needs to evolve alongside you, it can slowly become a prison. You wake up one day and feel trapped inside of a version of yourself that once protected you, but doesn't serve who you are today. Maybe you became the responsible one, the strong one, the sweet one, the party girl, the person who never needs help with anything. At first, maybe that identity worked. Maybe it helped keep you safe or gave you a sense of belonging. It may have even helped you survive hardship. But eventually, the question becomes, are you still choosing this identity with intention? Or are you performing it because you're scared of what happens when you stop? I want to be very clear about this. I am not faulting Elizabeth for cloistering herself in her maidenhood. The social ceilings for women at her time were brutal. And for women in power, the stakes were even higher. Elizabeth played the card she was dealt with extraordinary shrewdness, and I will always give her flowers for that. She turned limitation into power, suspicion into devotion. She turned unmarried womanhood into a national identity. Elizabeth reminds us that strength is good, conviction is good, tenacity is good. But you can have too much of a good thing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do for yourself is to release, to soften, to free yourself from your own rigid thinking and limiting beliefs, to open yourself up to growing and expanding in ways you never imagined. Elizabeth's maidenhood represented so much. It was her self-belief, her freedom, her dedication to England, but it also became a cage that she spent a lifetime gilding. And that's the hidden warning of the Virgin Queen. The same image that makes you powerful can also become the very image that keeps you trapped. Elizabeth I sacrificed so much for her country. She built herself around it, devoted herself to it entirely. She transformed herself into the ruler that her people needed her to be. And more than 400 years later, we're still talking about her as a visionary queen, a woman who was far ahead of her time, as one of the most successful rulers in English history, not just because she ruled brilliantly, but because she actively decided what her legacy would be. Behind the pristine image of the Virgin Queen was a real woman, brilliant and wounded, commanding but isolated, a woman who learned to make herself untouchable in order to survive. And maybe that's part of why her story still fascinates us, because so many of us understand what it is to build an identity out of self-protection, to become very, very good at playing a role, only to wake up years down the line and wonder, has that role become a cage? So I'd love to know your thoughts. Was Elizabeth's Virgin Queen image her greatest show of strength or her deepest prison? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and pull up a chair for more stories, psychology, and feminine archetypes. I'd love to have you. If you'd like to hear about another Tudor queen who was far ahead of her time, I'm gonna link my video to Elizabeth's mother, Anne, on screen now. So I'll see you over there, or I'll just catch you next time. Until then, take care of yourselves. Bye, guys.